Hi, and welcome, and thank you for joining us. And let me find our section that we're reading. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So we have troubling, interesting. It's a piece that requires a lot of meditation, you might say, and I'll do the best I can with it. So we are on to the next verse, and that has to do, remember, God had said after Noah offered up the offerings that no longer would he ever strike all the living, because the imaginings of a person's heart are bad from their youth up. We had a very lovely piece yesterday, which talks about as when the child emerges, and was commenting on this word min urav, which does not have a vav, and min arav and ni'er has to do with moving, shaking, showing that they are viable, etc., etc. So we're on to the next verse. Od kol yemei haaretz, as long as the earth endures, right? For the rest of the days of the earth. Zera v'katzir v'kor v'chom, right? So planting and harvesting and kor, cold v'chom and heat, v'kayetz v'choref, and summer and winter, v'yom v'layla, day and night. Lo yishbotu is the last word here. Right? And there's that word Shabbat, which for in our general context, when we talk about Shabbos, we mean the cessation of labor, the cessation of work. So generally speaking, it just means will never cease. They will never cease. So let's take a look at what we have here. Lo yishbotu. Amar Reish Lakish said, Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is one of the great Amoraim. He was the interlocutor of another great Amora by the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and their disagreements are mentioned many places in the Gemara. So, Oved Kochavim, an idolater, specifically an idolater, one who serves the stars. Sheshavat, who observes Shabbat, Chayav Mita, is deserving of death. It's a capital offense for an idolater to observe Shabbat, right? Why? Shneemar, as it says, v'yom v'layla lo yishbotu, and day and night they shall not cease, right? Or cease to work. They shall not observe Shabbat. V'amar mar, and an authority master said, Azara shelahem, that in a case where they are given a negative commandment, himitatam, that is a capital offense. So there's quite a lot to chew on in what we just read here, right? But apparently, I think there in this last little comment is this talking about their cultures, and that in their case, when they violate a law, it's quite possible the authorities will put them to death. And I cannot help thinking about a situation that occurred within our times. I believe it was in North Korea, where the dictator of North Korea was giving a speech, and one of the soldiers fell asleep, and he was subsequently executed. So that's just how strict they are. So let's take a look here. Yud Zayin, if I can find it quickly here. Piresh Rashi. So Rashi explains, Ovod kochavim sheshavat mimelachto yom shalem, that if an idolater observes Shabbat right from his melacha, his labor, yom shalem, for an entire day. In other words, so that's part of understanding observing Shabbat as a Shabbat. Chayav mita is deserving of capital punishment. Shneemar, as it says, vayom valayla lo yishbotu. So, and day and night they will not cease to in this case understood to labor. I believe that that Rashi is picking up on the fact that it says Yom Valayla, and that's why he says an entire day, right? Vidarish, and they interpret Lo Yishbotu Mimelacha, that when it says Lo Yishbotu, the they here, of course, referring to idolaters, Mimelacha, from labor, de Abnei Adam Nami Kae. In other words, that when it talks about the days and nights and harvest, etc., it's including human beings as well. It's including everything as part of creation. So, velo tema, that, and do not say, lo yishbotu ahanach sheshet ha'itim dekra ka'e, and do not say that when it says they shall not cease, that it only refers to these 6 times which the scripture is that occur in scripture. Klomar, that is to say, lo yivatlu, that is to say, so don't say that's all they mean, that's all this means. That lo yivatlu, that they'll never cease, velo yifsaku, and they won't come to an end, right? Milihiot, from existence. Ad kan lishono. And this is the end of the Rashi's explanation, assumedly in the Gemara there. Velo piresh hatam, but he did not explain the reason. Lama be'emet, why in actual fact, lo ne'emar, it isn't stated, dekra ka'e asheshetitim velo adam. So he doesn't explain why the scripture doesn't just refer to these 6 time periods, and it doesn't include human beings, right? V'nir'eh, and so it would appear, desvarale, that Rashi's of the opinion, Kamanda Amar, like the opinion that's held by Midrash Rabbah, okay, in the Midrash Rabbah, Perek Kafhe, this would be chapter 25, Diviyamei HaMabul, that during the days of the flood, when the flood was taking place, Lo Shavtu HaMazalot, that in fact the constellations continued their normal course. Velo nishtanu sidrei bereshit, and in fact, the order of creation or the orders of creation did not come to an end. So that's an opinion given in Midrash Rabbah, the Imkain, and if that is the case, Ifshar lefaresh. Okay, so if that's the case, that if in fact there were elements of creation that did not cease during the flood, we're going to go on with an argument that says, well, then how is God talking about right now only these time periods, right? Since they never ceased, you can't say they won't cease because they didn't cease back then. That's the point here, right? The ifshar, so imkain, if this is the case, ifshar lefaresh, you cannot interpret this verse to ka'e al ha'itim va'al hamazalot. You can't say it refers to the time periods, the seasons, and regarding the mazalot, right? The constellations. Acharei, since shegam ad hayom lo shavtu, because to that particular day they never ceased. So you can't say they won't cease in the future because they hadn't ceased. And the implication of this verse clearly is that it's not going to cease. Whatever it is that isn't going to cease again is because it ceased during the flood. Clearly, that's what the implication of the verse is, right? And for this reason, Piresh, he explained, Deka'e Adam, that it's referring to human beings. Klomar, that is to say, Shebechol ha'itim va'azmanim lo yishbatu mimelacha. That in fact, what it's suggesting then, or saying, right, that all these different time periods, they should never cease from laboring again. They will not have to do that. And of course, during the flood, since they were wiped out, all that activity came to an end. So we're understanding this verse now basically to mean that that God isn't talking about the seasons that depend on the Earth's position around the sun relative to that, or the stars, etc., and their courses, etc., but rather that he's referring to the fact that in the future human beings will never have to cease from human activity in the future. That's what this is saying. That's quite a remarkable interpretation that we are understanding. V'hinei, but he says, and here, lo nitpa'er bechlal, nothing, there's no explanation. It's not clarified at all. Tam mitzvah zo, right? The reason for this particular commandment, in other words, they shall not cease their labor, and if they do, right, v'ha'onish, and the punishment, mita also, and the fact that this is a capital offense, that isn't so clear. For ulayit ba'er, and maybe we can explain it. Al pimanda amar or mada amar. We can explain it by what is mentioned be'avot de Rabbi Natan in another midrash called Avot the fathers of Rabbi Natan. This is a midrash that is extant, right? Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11, Allah Pasuk, regarding the verse, Sheshit Yamim Ta'avod, 6 days you shall labor, Va'asita kol melachtecha, and you shall do all your labor in those 6 days. Ma Talmud Lomar. So this is of course all from Avot de Rabbi Natan. Ma Talmud Lomar. What is Scripture trying to teach us? Va'asita kol melachtecha or kol melachtecha. When it says you shall do all your labor. Ritzono, that you've only got 6 days to do that, right? Ritzono lomar. So in other words, what it's saying is, achar dichtiv sheshit yamim ta'avod, since it does already say you will labor for 6 days, you shall work for 6 days. So what's it adding to that? Right? Why is it saying you shall perform all your labor? It says already you shall do it for those 6 days. Lahavi mi sheyesh lo chatzerot osadot. This is to include this little part that we just talking about here, is to include mi sheyesh lo chatzerot osadot charevot. Okay, I think, right, that if he has courtyards or fields that are destroyed, yelech v'yasok bahem, that he should go and involve himself in them. מפני שאין אדם מת אלא מתוך הבטלה, on account that a person, this looks like it says, that a person doesn't die, right, except if he ceases from everything, right? That when you're left without anything to do, you will die adkan, and this up to now, right? So in other words, what it's saying is that I'm trying to think of what he says is when it says kol melachtecha, right? That addition of that is to include the prohibition of going and working in these courtyards or these fields that are basically left ruined, I would say, right? That you shouldn't do that, okay? And again, this is not so simple or straightforward, but at any rate, perhaps it's because one would be tempted to do it. V'habiur pashut, and the clear explanation is dekevan shehabatela gormeret mita la'adam kodem zmano, that if a person stops and doesn't involve themselves in anything, it tends to bring death on earlier. It would create death for a person before his time. Lachen, for that reason, af al pi, despite the fact she'ein lo la'adam melacha hatzricha lo, right, that even though this person doesn't have necessary work to do, b'chol zeh, nevertheless, yishtadel lahamtzi lo ezu melacha, he needs to find some sort of labor, shehi, some ezer melacha shehi, af she'einat tzricha legufa ata, even though he might not need to do it right now. It may not be necessary. In other words, we need to stay occupied. right? So I think the point about these courtyards and fields that are charevot, I think he means that even that it includes those sorts of things as well. When it says kol malacha, the kol malacha means even the kind of work that isn't necessary. In other words, he's intentionally leaving these things unattended and going to ruin and getting ruined, okay? But the point about this is that it's so important for a person to keep occupied, right? That needs to be included as to what is forbidden on Shabbat. This is my understanding of it at this point, okay? So even though this isn't work that is absolutely necessary, right? It's still important. It's because it's so important for a person to stay occupied. They need even the work that isn't necessarily necessary is important and helps a person. V'rak kadei shelo yelech batel v'lo yamut. So the only reason he's going to attend to such kind of work is that he should be occupied and not die. V'yesh lechavein al pi zeh. And so,
So,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, David, I
so
didn't see your hand. Go ahead.
no, it's okay. I just raised it.
Yeah.
So, through all of that, does it mean that it is okay to do work that is not necessary but occupies you so that you don't die? Or I mean, is yeah, is that okay or not
Okay.
okay?
Good, good. Okay, so I thought I cleared it up, but my understanding right now is that it is not okay to do it on Shabbat. In
Okay.
other words, the reason why, if we go back and look at that sentence, it says 6 days you shall, 6 days you shall, let's see, right. 6 days you shall labor and perform all your work. So the question is, what do you mean all your work? If it says already 6 days you shall labor, why are we including and do all your work? Okay. So, and then it says, but on the seventh day you shall rest. So, in other words, it's coming to tell you that even that addition of kol melachtecha is to include work that is you're not doing for your livelihood. Okay.
Yep.
Even that kind of thing. All right. I I hate to tell you what it might include, okay? But if that work includes stuff that is forbidden on the Shabbat, you shouldn't do it. Meaning, even if it's recreation. In other words, if there are things that involve a violation of the Shabbat that are even just nothing more than recreation, it's still not allowed on Shabbat.
Okay.
So I mean, it's looking at this verse very seriously because if it says 6 days and it's 6 days you shall labor, but on the Shabbat you should rest. It doesn't say that. It says on 6 days you shall labor and perform all your work. What do you mean all your work? Well, all your work is including work that we could call essentially recreation. That's what's that I believe is what the point that's being made. Okay. So, v'yesh lekaven al pizeh, and so we can understand. Uh, sorry, I don't think we did this right. Lekaven to intend al pizeh, according to this amar, the statement dola melacha, that labor, being involved in some kind of work is great. It's terribly important. Shemechaye et baaleha, because it gives life to its owners, mechaye mamash. In other words, when it says it gives life to them, it means literally gives them life. Or lefize, and according to this, yesh lomar, we can say the tam hadavar, right, regarding the reason that shetzivah hakadosh baruch hu, that God commanded al avodat adam regarding the labor of man, kedei shelo yigrom la'atzmo mita. In other words, we're asking, why does it have to say? I think the point here is, why does it say as a commandment, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work? In other words, not only looking at that statement in reference to the fact that you can't do it on the seventh day, but the fact that there is a commandment to work 6 days and do all your labor. So that part of the commandment is saying even stuff that you don't have to do, right? Even if you left your fields and your courtyards, basically alone and didn't need to attend to it, right? Totally retired, complete retirement, right? It's saying no. God is saying in this part of the verse, you need to do stuff. Okay? All right. Right. V'yeh lefi zeh, and according to this, bi'or hashon, right, we can understand this expression chayav mita is deserving of death. Me'ein kavanat halashon mitchayev benasho. So we can understand this rather than saying it as a punishment, I believe he's saying here, right? But rather to understand it as saying that it will cause them to die, that not engaging in labor is going to cause them to die. And despite the fact that according to this, haya min hadin, right, it would be legal, right, min hadin, a legal thing, shelav davka be'oved kochavim, that if this is the case, why are we saying that it's only referring to idolaters? Elagam Yisrael. Shouldn't this apply also to Jews? Yeah, Din Cain should. If we're understanding this statement in the sense that what the Torah, what Reish Lakish is saying here, right, and the Amar Mar is saying, has more to do with the necessity of keeping ourselves occupied in order to stay alive, right? Then why does it only apply to non-Jews? Why doesn't it apply to Jews as well? That's what we're saying. In other words, if we're not seeing it as a punishment, right, by a court, you might say, but rather simply more as an observation and a command to keep ourselves occupied, keep people occupied, why does that only apply to non-Jews? Why doesn't it also apply to an Israelite, right? Yesh lomar, one could say, de Yisrael, that with regard to an Israelite, right? Yachol la'asok b'Torah. A Jew can busy occupy themselves in Torah, uva avodah, and in service. In other words, we have stuff to do on Shabbos. On Shabbos, we study Torah. On Shabbos, we go to shul. Be'et shvitato, at the time when he ceases from regular labor. Masha enkein oved kachavim, which an idolater, and let's put a diuk, right? Let's put an emphasis on an idolater. So idolater, we don't mean non-Jew. We're talking about an idolater. Ha'osek b'Torah, right? Misha ein nochen oved kachavim, ha'osek b'Torah, haya chayav mita, right? So this is a this is difficult to understand, but at least it seems to say, right, that if an idolater occupies in the Torah, in actually studying Torah, not for the sake of let's say becoming more observant and learning Judaism, but perhaps just as a casual study, perhaps to mock it, perhaps to prove it wrong, etc. And he says, "Ien lefanenu barosh perik bracha Torah tziva lanu," right? And he's saying, I believe, right? Pasuk, Rosh Pasuk, I believe, right? There's a statement, right? He says, "Look ahead." I believe he's saying, right, at the beginning of the verse, his commentary on in the beginning of Zot HaBracha, the very last parsha in Deuteronomy, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, right? It says where Torah tziva lanu Moshe. The Moses commanded us the Torah. V'ha'esek b'sheva mitzvot tidhu mu'at v'kal, right? And the fact is that occupying yourself, like when it comes for us to study Torah, it's huge, right? It's an ocean. But remember, the Bnei Noach, right, have only 7 commandments to study. And he says studying just those 7 commandments that they have to deal with, muat, there's not a lot to study, v'kal, and it's pretty straightforward. Im kain, and if this is the case, ein lo derech acheret litasek, there is no other way for him to be occupied. Ki im b'malacha, except in melacha, right? In labor. V'hamar avot Rabbi Natan. And that discussion, that statement in Avot Rabbi Natan, Ulai Ire, and perhaps it's dealing with the Ish Hamoni. So this looks like Ish Hamoni is an expression that I'm not that familiar, but it could be talking about the hoi polloi, right? The person who is an uneducated person, she'eino mesugal lasek b'Torah, Torah, who has no ability whatsoever to occupy themselves in Torah study. I'm going on a little more. For I dine, but he says one still has to tzarich iyun. We still have to look carefully at what's going on here, right? It requires further study, further investigation. B'ma shekatav harambam, regarding what Maimonides wrote, be'inyan zeh, regarding this matter. Be'perik tet in chapter 9, halacha tet, so this is a law 9, chapter 9, law number 9, Melachim, regarding kings. That's the chapter in the Mishnah Torah called the section called Melachim. The din zeh, that this particular law, hu rak im shavat l'shem mitzvat shvita, that this law only applies if he rested, if he ceased from labor, for the sake of the mitzvah of resting. She'as'o la'atzmo, that he did for himself. Kamo Yom HaShabbat, like the Sabbath day. Obviously, this is still not saying it requires further thought. For rak as, and only in such a circumstance, chayav mita, is he deserving of death, of capital punishment, or death. Ulefi dvarenu, and according to what we said, halo ein nafka mina lechora, he's saying, according to what we said, there isn't any, I think what he's saying is a conclusion that you can reach, or very often it's called a practical difference, lichora, apparently, be'eza kavana shobet. In other words, what difference does it make whether this idolater is doing it for the sake of the mitzvah of Shabbos, just for themselves, not as a member of the Jewish people, but just for themselves, right? V'yesh li yashev, and it's maybe we can figure this out, right? We can find a way to understand this. That kol zman she'eino shovet keshvitat Shabbat, that as long as he's not ceasing from labor, like the Shabbat, right? According to the Shabbat, shvita shlema, that is to say, an absolute cessation of labor. Eino batel mamash melacha. If that's the case, if they're not completely absolving or not participating in any work, right? Then he's not completely batel mimelacha. He's not actually ceasing from labor. Dehalo oseku b'milachot kalot, because he is probably engaging in very light work. Uvotzorchei ochel nefesh, and so, for example, like cooking, right? He's probably doing that. And he says there's no need to go any further into this particular discussion. So lots of challenging ideas going on here. I'm going to stop the share and see if any of you want to comment about this. Okay. Yes, Harlan, I see you do want to say something. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know about the 39 laborers, but I don't do the 39 laborers. But in the modern day, the 21st century, we do have television, we do have books to read. I don't know if that's recreation that is forbidden, or could we see the television and read some books besides studying Torah? I studied Torah for hours, and then I decided I'm going to sleep. I'm going to have to do something else. Yes. So if you turn on the television, I'll read a book. Right. Is that recreation, or is that okay?
Okay, so you're asking me now a practical question, right? Here we were discussing theoretical, right, Torah. Obviously, there are supposed to be practical applications, but to actually apply these particular principles in life is a much more nuanced thing for us, because it depends on a lot of circumstances. And we know that when it comes to actually putting Torah into practice, we have to take into account lots of other factors. So I would say, if you want to say strictly speaking, obviously in an Orthodox home that is very strictly Orthodox, they would not turn on a television.
Oh,
Okay, they would not. But the truth is that for many of us, that would be asking too much. And sometimes that very practice has negative consequences. And so that's why you're asking me an extremely difficult question. I can answer it theoretically, but you should understand that my answer is theoretical and not necessarily practical. Because I would say that as an identified Jew, right, as a person who identifies as an Israelite, you do the best you can. You do absolutely the best you can, and you try to take into account the circumstances, and you try to be honest with yourself, etc. Now, as far as the issue about a non-Jew observing Shabbat, that is, I think that Torah Temimah was trying very hard to say that it's not a punishment per se for a non-Jew to observe Shabbat. It's simply describing the realities of it. So he wants to get away from judging the idea that a non-Jew who observes Shabbat is actually committing a capital offense. He wants to get away from that. And he wants to try to understand this simply as being a practical outcome. That what was being said here simply was a practical outcome and not necessarily a punishment. And then he takes on the challenge of understanding Maimonides, who seems to be suggesting that as well. And he tries to harmonize that as well, and saying to understand Maimonides in that sense as well. So it's interesting. I mean, the point about keeping occupied, right? Keeping the mind occupied, keeping the person occupied as being so intensely part of being alive and remaining alive. I think there is great truth to that. And so if there's any, let's say, positive, practical outcome of what we study today, I would say that particular notion is gold. So if anyone has any other comments, I will take them. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording.
yeah. A lot of times I on Shabbos to keep myself busy, I read the Tanakh, and then sometimes I'm reading the Torah, but you have to have somebody that really knows, like you, like the rabbi. There's a lot of questions when I'm reading the Torah. I want somebody to answer it, and there's nobody there to answer for me.
I do understand. I know. Yeah. I mean, you just, Harlan, this is not the first time we've had a conversation where you feel guilty about things. And
yeah,
I think it's your sweet soul. It really is. You have a very sweet soul. And I think that, God is guiding you, and you're trying to do whatever you can to love God with all your heart, soul, and might. And while I don't want to totally placate you, nevertheless, I think, I want to reassure you, and I want to encourage you and say, Halavai, more of us could be like Harlan. So I'll
thank
take,
you, Rabbi.
of course. Okay.